Hello, and welcome to week one. In week one, we'll be talking about the theoretical basis for ethical decision making. And we'll see that this course really can be broken out into three different modules. In the first module, in the first part of the course, we're going to be talking about rules and standards. We'll be talking about theory or the philosophical foundations for decision making and ethics. In the second part of this course, we'll be talking about what the law says for accounting and ethics. And in the third module or third component of this course, we're going to be combining everything together. And we'll be doing that by using a number of different case studies. So in week one, you can see that these are the objectives. These first three can be combined together. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about what ethics really means. What does it mean to be ethical? How is ethics different from morality? People oftentimes use the terms interchangeably, and they say, if I'm ethical, it also means I'm moral. Okay, that's true, but what's the difference? People think that being ethical just means following the law, but we'll see that they're similar but not exactly the same. And finally, ethics and etiquette are different, and they can also have some overlap and sometimes be the same. In this course, the goal is to think about decision making. So we'll talk about the different components of decision making. We'll be talking about the fact that you can emphasize the intent and action, or you can emphasize the end result. Okay, so that means that you can either be a non-consequentialist or a consequentialist. We'll discuss what that means. Additionally, we'll talk about how to identify an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is a problem. But just because you have a problem doesn't mean you have an ethical dilemma. So for example, if I say, should I have peanut butter and strawberry jelly or peanut butter and grape jelly? That's a problem, but it's not an ethical dilemma. If you say, should you dump toxic chemicals in a lake? That's obviously an ethical dilemma. But how do you know if you have a situation that isn't as clear-cut as one or the other, something that is kind of on the line? We can talk about the tests for an ethical dilemma. Finally, we'll talk about using a framework for ethical decision making. Okay, so a framework approach is going to be mechanical and then personal. So we'll talk about what that means. All right, so first, let's talk about morality and ethics. Very simply stated, morality is theoretical. So it's the theoretical study of right versus wrong, whereas ethics is more practical. So for example, morality would be like taking a chemistry class. So chemistry is pretty theoretical. I took chemistry when I was in college, and I learned about a lot of different concepts, but I didn't really learn how to make anything. I didn't learn how to cook anything. I didn't learn how to make aspirin, for example, right? Because chemistry is more of a theoretical class, just as morality is more about theory as well. Now, ethics would be taking a cooking class or a baking class. If you take a cooking or baking class, the deliverable or the end result is very clear. In a cooking or baking class, by the end of the course, you're going to know how to saute vegetables, or you're going to know how to make a certain dish, right? So you can think of ethics as something that's similar to cooking or baking in the sense that you have a defined deliverable. And that deliverable is how to make effective ethical decisions. Okay, so that's the purpose of a course like this. It's also important to note that oftentimes many people think that ethics and the law are exactly the same thing, and they're not. So you can see that we have a Venn diagram here, and we have ethics, that's the circle on the left, and we have the law, which is the circle on the right. Now, there is some overlap, which is the middle part, and this points out the notion that ethics and the law are similar, but they're not always the same. Okay? So ethics is about doing the right thing. The law is about prescribing a minimum. Okay, so for example, the law might say that you have to file quarterly financial statements. We call that a 10Q. And if you don't file quarterly financial statements, then you're subject to some type of penalty. Okay, so you can see that the law is composed of a couple of things. So with the law, you can see that there is typically either a positive or a negative obligation placed on somebody. So positive means you have to do something. I have to file a 10Q every quarter. Or the law might prescribe a negative, which means that you have to refrain from doing something. So for example, you cannot engage in insider trading. That would be a negative obligation. So the law is going to prescribe or promulgate some type of positive or negative expectation, and they're going to have some type of penalty that's associated with it. Okay, maybe the penalty is going to be pretty minor. Okay, so you may have to pay interest, or you may have to go to prison, right? But you can see that the law is its own field of study. Let's look at this Venn diagram here. We can see we have ethics on the left, the law on the right, and later on we're going to add another circle, and that's going to be accounting. So accounting will be at the bottom here. Okay, so we can see that some issues are going to be in region 1. We have actually 3 regions here. We have region 1, which is on the left side. Region 3 is on the right side. And look at region 2. Region 2 is the intersection of ethics and the law. So region 1 is where you have an issue that is ethical but not legal. Okay? So ethical but not legal might mean that you're doing something that is the right thing, but the law says you can't do it. Or it could mean region 1 is where you are doing the right thing, but the law doesn't say anything with regard to what you're doing. It doesn't say whether it's right or not because there's no law on the books. Region 3 means that you're following the law, so the law actually has something on the books that you have to follow, either a negative or a positive obligation, but either it's unethical or it's not a matter of ethics at all. Region 2 is where you are doing something that is ethical, it's the right thing to do, and the law has something to say about it, and the law says you should be doing a certain action or conducting yourself a certain way. Let's look at region 1. So you can see region 1 would be, for example, hiding Jews in your home in Nazi Germany. Okay, so that's an example of doing the right thing, but the law says you should not be doing it. Another example of region 1 might be providing additional financial information to investors. That might be the right thing to do in a certain circumstance, but the law doesn't say you have to do it. Okay, so it's not an issue necessarily for Area 1 of being ethical and the law is against you. It could also mean being ethical, doing the right thing, but the law has nothing to say. It's not saying whether you should do it or not. So if I decide to disclose additional financial information, I'm doing what I think is the right thing, but the law doesn't require me to do it. I'm going actually beyond the law. I'm doing more than what the law says. Look at area number 3. Area number 3 is an issue that is legal but not ethical. Okay, so in the example that I have, in 1850 slavery was legal, but obviously it was wrong. It was not ethical. I can think of another example of region 3, which is legal and not ethical. It could be, for example, filing your taxes on April 15th. That's region 3 or area 3. So if you file your taxes on April 15th, you do that because that's the law. That's what the law says you have to do, right? That is a positive obligation. You must file on April 15th. However, it's not an issue of ethics at all, because why not April 14th or April 17th, right? So you can see that Region 3 is about following the law, and you're doing something that is either not ethical or maybe it has nothing to do with ethics at all. Region 2 is an example of ethical and legal. In the example that I give you here, I have obeying the speed limit. If you obey the speed limit, it's the right thing to do, but also the law says you have to do it. So that's going to be area number 2. So in summary, we can say that ethics and the law are similar, but they're not exactly the same. Same thing with ethics and etiquette. Etiquette is just polite conduct. Okay, so ethics and etiquette can be similar, but they're not always the same. The purpose of a class in ethics is to make decisions. So at the end of the day, ethics is about decision making, as Kenneth Goodpaster says. And when you make decisions, there are really 2 components. You have intent and action on the one hand, and then you have the consequences on the other hand. Now, this is extremely important. So you can see that intent and action is really what you do. The consequences are about what happens. Now, in a perfect world, we would think that intent and action and consequences should be equally important. Okay. But in reality, people tend to prioritize either intent or action, or they prioritize consequences. Let me give you an example. Let's say I have toxic chemicals, and I'm trying to figure out, should I dump toxic chemicals in a nearby lake? Because if I dump toxic chemicals in a nearby lake, I can save money, I don't have to pay for hazardous material removal, and my profits will be better. So if I decide I'm going to go ahead and dump toxic chemicals in a lake because I'm just going to be happy with the fact that I'm going to have more profit, I don't have as much hassle. In that case, the intent and action is less important than the consequence. Because if I tell you I'm going to dump toxic chemicals in a lake, the reason why, the most important thing for me is that I'm trying to save money. Then you're saying that the ends justify the means. The end that I want is that I want to save money and maximize profit, and I really don't care about what I have to do to get there. So the intent and the action is less important. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get the consequence that I want. So if you think that the consequence is the most important thing, then that's called being a consequentialist. That's also called a teleological approach to ethics or decision making. You might know a lot of people that think that the end result is the most important thing, and they'll do whatever they need to do to get the end result. Now, it sounds like I'm saying that consequentialism is always unethical, and that's not really true. Because, for example, if you're trying to save a life, then maybe you would be okay with speeding, right? So, the act of speeding is not very good because you're doing that thinking that, well, in this case, the end result, like saving a life, is more important, so I'm prioritizing the consequence. In that case, it's not necessarily unethical. If you're the type of person that thinks that it's always good and it's always the most important thing to do when you consider the action, then you're called a non-consequentialist, and that's a deontological approach. Okay, so if you think that it's always important to do the right thing, no matter what the consequence is, because the action is more important, then that's called a non-consequentialist approach. This is going to be very important as we continue on with the course this summer, because we'll be talking about these two things and thinking about laws. Okay, so laws are designed to either focus on the intent or action, or laws are going to be focused on trying to get a certain consequence or end result. Okay. So laws are going to be action-based or consequence-based. And we'll talk about how that plays into accounting later on in the course. Now, not every problem is an ethical dilemma. So you can have problems that have nothing to do with ethics. So the example that I mentioned was, should I have peanut butter and strawberry jelly or peanut butter and grape jelly? That has nothing to do with ethics at all. It's a problem, but it's not an ethical one. The example that I gave of dumping toxic chemicals in a lake is clearly an ethical dilemma. Now, if you have something that's very extreme, it's very easy to spot an ethical dilemma. But a lot of times you'll have a situation that's kind of on the line where it's difficult to identify, is this really an ethical dilemma or is it not an ethical dilemma? There are two tests for identifying an ethical dilemma. If you pass any one of these two tests, then you can say you have an ethical dilemma. The first test is, will somebody be harmed by the decision that I make? That's called the harm test. Okay, that's really the most universally known test for an ethical dilemma. And the second test is conflicting values. Are you in a situation where you have to prioritize one value over another value? So, for example, should I dump toxic chemicals in a lake? Well, in that case, I have to think about which values are more important to me. Am I going to prioritize profit first, or am I going to prioritize my responsibility to the community? So we can see from that perspective that you have a conflicting set of values, and that's an indication that the situation that you have is an ethical dilemma. It's important to note that this notion of profit is going to repeatedly come up this semester. So is it important to maximize profit, or is it important to maintain your obligation to the community? So a lot of business issues are really ethical dilemmas, if you think about it that way. Okay, so for an ethical dilemma, you can apply two tests. Now, if you have an ethical dilemma, it's important to think about how to approach an ethical dilemma. This is called a framework approach in number 6. Okay, so framework means that you have a set of standards or you have a set of rules that you apply. Now here you have 5 different steps. Now, depending on where you look, for example, the AICPA might have 8 steps to ethical decision making, or the Institute of Management Accountants may have 4 steps, or this book may have 6 steps, or if you look at a book by a different author, they may have 7 steps. What they all have in common is the fact that the steps are mechanical and then personal. Let's look at the first step here, gathering the facts. Gathering the facts is pretty mechanical. There's no opinion that needs to be made. It's really just analysis of data that's out there. Which facts are important? Which facts are not important to the problem at hand? Do you have a fact? Are you making an assumption? Or are you not sure whether something is true or not? These are steps that are going to focus on what you do here, and these are about gathering the facts, which is very mechanical. Now, sometimes you have to make an ethical decision where you don't have all the facts. So that really points out the notion that ethical decision making sometimes is about playing the angles. and making decisions even if you aren't able to have all the facts. Look at this last decision here that you have to make in terms of following these steps. Checking your gut. Checking your gut just means, do you feel good about the decision that you make? So checking your gut is very personal in nature. Can you sleep well at night making the decision that you decide to make? And we have mechanical first, personal last, and then in the middle, we have mechanical and personal. Identifying values, issues, and problems. Okay, so values are pretty straightforward. What's important to me? Who do I have an obligation to? A lot of times in corporate social responsibility, we talk about the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps are people, profit, and planet. Okay? So organizations have an obligation to people, their employees, they have an obligation to management, to shareholders, to the community. Companies also have an obligation to the bottom line, to show profit. And profit is measured under a lot of different metrics: profit margin, return on investment, return on assets. And companies also have an obligation to the environment or the planet, right? That's the last P. So when you have an ethical dilemma, you have to balance and try to maximize all these different values or elements. And you have to separate issues and problems. So issues are different from problems because an issue is something that is subject to debate by reasonable minds. A problem is something that's universally agreed upon. A problem demands a solution. So if I say, for example, that in a certain community, crime is increasing, everybody would agree that crime increasing, especially if it's increasing by a lot, is a big problem. Now the issues could be, well, maybe there's not enough street lights. Okay, so that would be an issue. I mean, maybe there are enough street lights, but we can debate that. Maybe the issue is that the community is increasing in population. So maybe that's an issue that we need to talk about. Maybe it's not an issue. So population. You can see that issues are subject to debate. These are things that we can have a discussion on. And sometimes if you think something is an issue, it may not be an issue. If I say that in a certain community, crime is increasing, maybe the issue is streetlights. Well, maybe we already have enough streetlights, so maybe that's not an issue. If I say that crime is increasing in a certain community, the fact that it's increasing 75% is a problem. Everybody agrees that we need to do something about it. Look at this next step for ethical decision making, identifying stakeholders. Okay? So you can see identifying stakeholders is really an extension of what we just talked about here with values, but it's more specific. Stakeholders are people that are affected by the decision that you make. It's important to specify who they are specifically so that you can figure out a decision that's going to balance all these different needs of these different stakeholders. If you're a CEO, then you have a lot of stakeholders. You may have to worry about the board of directors. You have to worry about management. Maybe you have to worry about your employees. Stakeholders can be more specific. Maybe you have to worry about your obligation to John, Mary, or Sue. The next step is to weigh alternatives and think creatively. What are the different options that I have? Which option is going to be the best option to pursue? Now, if you think that the action is the most important component that you need to think about, then which approach is that if you think that the action is most important? That's a non-consequentialist emphasis. If you think that the end result is the most important thing, what is that called? The end result. That's called the consequence. Okay, finally, let's talk about the Cuneiform framework. It's not spelled Cuneiform, but that's how it's pronounced. The Cuneiform framework says that you have decision making that can occur in different environments. So you have 4 different environments here. So in a simple situation, you have simple rules. And you can just figure out what the best practice is going to be. So if you make a journal entry, that's basically a simple problem because you have simple rules that you have to follow, and then you can figure out the best way to make a journal entry. Complicated problems are where you have difficult rules. Maybe they're difficult because you have to be an expert to understand the rules. Maybe the rules are difficult because you need to research them. But if you have a complicated problem, then it's important to apply good practice and use experts. So if you have, for example, a complicated tax issue, maybe it's a tax issue that needs a lot of research, and you need to find subject matter experts, that's a complicated problem. A complex problem is where the rules change. And in that case, you should probe and analyze. Office politics. Running a business. These are all complex problems. Because if you run a business, maybe there aren't any rules in place for your industry, or the rules are changing all the time. So in these situations where you have complex problems, the best thing to do is to do something, probe, and then evaluate how your action turns out, and then kind of adjust and then make new decisions going forward. Be adaptive and flexible. That's going to be the way to handle a complex problem. If you have a chaotic problem, it means that rules don't exist. And the best thing to do is just act. Do something and try to influence the trajectory of the situation. Okay, so today we talked about a couple of different things. We talked about what ethics really means. We talked about decision making, how to make proper decisions. And finally, we talked about an ethical dilemma. What an ethical dilemma means and how to approach an ethical dilemma. If you have any questions for me, make sure to post them in the discussion area or send me an email and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Thank you.